Hello, everyone. I'm Gloria Blackwell, CEO of the American Association of University Women, and welcome to Women in Work, Increasing Leadership and Economic Equity as part of the NGO CSW 66 Forum. I hope that all of you have been taking advantage of the numerous workshops, panels, and trainings that have taken place so far this week and that will continue into the following week. And we thank you for joining us this afternoon. We're looking forward to a great conversation. AAUW is an organization that is celebrating our 140th anniversary this year. 140 years of advancing equity for women and girls through education, research, and advocacy. And we're excited to bring you today's program. So the pandemic has had an unequal economic toll on women, as we all know, particularly women of color, and it will have economic ramifications for decades to come, compounding the already existing gender inequities. And though we have seen an increase in the attention and resources devoted to addressing gender inequality in the workplace, we clearly have not managed to close the gender gap across a number of different outcomes, such as pay and access to leadership positions. Yesterday, as many of you know, was Equal Pay Day, the day which, on average, women have to work in order to earn the same amount that men earned the previous year. That now stands at 83 cents on the dollar. But we know that the pay gap figures don't really reflect the reality of how COVID affected women's workplace experience. Women are more likely to have left the workforce during the pandemic, mainly because of caregiving responsibilities and school closures. Others left because their jobs in retail, service, and hospitality simply disappeared. And these women, many of whom are low-wage workers, are not included in wage gap calculations, but that will be changing. But let's face it, systemic racism and sexism are baked into our workforce, including occupational segregation, workplaces that really don't accommodate the reality of contemporary families, and so many other factors that continue to hinder women, especially Black and Brown women, from advancing in leadership roles. But we're here to talk about what needs to be done. When you registered for this event, many of you identified what you see as the biggest challenges and solutions for equity for women in the workforce right now, and we'll be discussing many of them, from childcare to flexible schedules. So let's get started. This afternoon, we have with us Katie Collins. She is an assistant professor of sociology at Washington University in St. Louis. Dr. Collins studies gender inequality in the workplace and family life. Her research examines how culture and policy intersect to both reduce and reproduce inequality. She is the author of the 2020 William J. Good Book Award winning Making Motherhood Work: How Women Manage Careers and Caregiving, which explores how different ideals of gender, motherhood, and employment are embedded in public policies and how they shape the daily lives of mothers. And you can learn more about her work at CaitlinCollins.com. Next, welcome Katie. Next, we have Dawn Kimball. She is a learning and development professional with more than 10 years of experience in workforce development and community engagement. She provides leadership in the creation of high-impact, interactive trainings that help mission-driven programs promote equitable progress. She has worked with university departments, community service organizations, and faith-based organizations to successfully upscale initiatives and plan innovative programming. She is driven by the question, how can we make complex developmental information accessible and engaging to populations with needs for unique options to narrow the educational gap? Welcome, Dawn. Next, we have Kristen Kavanaugh, who is the Senior Director of Inclusion, Talent, and Learning at Tesla, founder of the Military Acceptance Project, and a United States Marine Corps veteran. After graduating from the United States Naval Academy, she ascended to the rank of captain in the Marine Corps and deployed to Iraq's Al Anbar province in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom. She then pursued her master's degree in social work at the Dworak Peck School of Social Work at the University of Southern California and spent the next several years of her career in the civilian workforce as a business leader and advocate in the LGBTQ plus and veteran communities. Welcome, Kristen. So let's get started. Societal and cultural values play an important role in how we feel about how we're supposed to perform in the office and at home. How much of that emotion do you think is driven by women's own expectations for themselves versus society's expectations for them? So let's get started. How about Katie? You want to go first?
I'd be happy to. Thanks for the kind introduction, Gloria. It's a pleasure to serve on this panel alongside such esteemed women. I feel like I'm putting on my professor hat now. In my Sociology 101 class, one of the central messages I tried to communicate to my students is that we cannot think of ourselves as somehow existing or operating separate from the society in which we all live day in and day out, right? It's not like we are here and society is over here and we step in and step out as we want, right? In fact, we're vessels for the communities in which we live, the organizations in which we work, right? The cultural values that we are embedded in and socialized into from the moment we're born. And so thinking about how we might think of our own personal beliefs, I think of them as being inherently tied to, both reflected and reinforcing of broader cultural beliefs, right? So our broader cultural beliefs about what we think men and women can and should do and should be capable of are reinforced by broader social and cultural ideals. And these extend, of course, beyond gender and intersectional ways with things like the messages we are taught from a very young age about race and ethnicity, about social class, about sexual orientation, right? So if we're thinking about how women conceive of the ideas about how they want to participate in our communities and in our world, we have to think of those as I think sort of inextricably tied to the community in which we live. And when we have beliefs that are oppressive in nature, right, we have to work very conscientiously to push back against them because we've been socialized, for example, to believe, right, that one that my work focuses on is women's disproportionate responsibility for caregiving, right? That women can and should be the primary caregivers in their households, when the truth is that men have every bit the capacity to be an equally participatory member of their family's household and caring for kiddos. So that's one cultural belief that I try to mention to my students and folks in talks that we need to sort of push back against. But again, we have to think about how these identities are taught to us and how we can also push back against them in ways that kind of advance the goals of equity and justice.
Absolutely. It gave us that's a great note and a lot to digest to start out. Dawn, what are your thoughts?
Thank you for having me.
Oh,
Like
welcome.
Caitlin said, our society is already a moving system. We're already a part of it. So many times our voice is the voice that has been told to us, taught to us, ingrained in us. So how do we root ourselves in our truth? How do we find ourselves in what really works for us as women when our society has told us, oh, you are the caregiver, or you're the person who should take on these burdens, or don't worry about earning less because, you have that husband at home who's going to provide for you. And it's in our experiences and the things that happen to us that help us to understand that these things aren't working for us. The way the status quo isn't working for us on a regular basis, and we find those gaps. So, how do we fill them? You know, how do we connect with other women? How do we amplify our voices? How do we make society understand that no, the way you outlined everything, the way things have been created isn't necessarily beneficial to us all? So I'm more questions than I am answers, but I'm hoping that as a collective, you know, we can come to those answers.
Absolutely. Thanks, Dawn. Kristen?
And I think, you know, what we're talking about is the unconscious biases that we all have and have been taught, as Katie and Don were expertly explaining. And it's really hard when you step into your own blind spot and realize that you might have unconscious thoughts about yourself and what you are capable and should be capable of doing, and how you should show up at work. And I think it's really thinking through how we're able to recognize that first, and then be willing to explore what some of those blind spots that we have about our own selves are, and how we can start to systematically dismantle that in our own beliefs, to start to show up at home and at work the way that we want to, not the way that we have been told that we have to. But I think a lot of that is deep personal work that we all have to start with ourselves, before we can go save the masses.
Absolutely. And I think that, you know, it's a question that doesn't have, you know, a singular response, you know, right? So we are both the product, you know, and the result of the expectations that we have of ourselves, and our society. And it's also ever changing and evolving as our society evolves and change. Thank you all so much. So let's start with the conversation around women in the work. And I want to start with you, Katie. So during the pandemic, we've seen a breakdown in what was already a fragile caregiving infrastructure, right? So let's not pretend that prior to the pandemic that all of these things were working well, because they weren't. So can you talk a bit about your research and your writing and some of the advocacy work that you have done around work and family justice, please?
My pleasure. Yeah, so I think it's important to contextualize what's happening to women in the pandemic with the larger reality, which is just how hard things were for women before the pandemic in the United States. My research, as you mentioned, focuses on policy and on culture. And the United States already had what is widely considered to be the most family hostile public policy of any Western industrialized country, right? So the fact that we have no federal paid parental leave, no federal minimum standard for vacation and sick days. That means your boss doesn't have to give you one paid day off a year, right? As if we are robots working day in and day out. No federal increase in the minimum wage for many years now. We have no social insurance entitlement, right? I could go on and on. What this means is that we have quite a weak infrastructure of care in the United States. And we tend to think of families and child rearing in particular as private and personal responsibilities, right? And what that really means is that it's women's private and personal responsibility for keeping their households afloat. And the research that you mentioned that I feature in my book is an interview study with women who are middle-class working mothers in Sweden, Germany, Italy, and the United States. I wanted to see what life was like for working mothers at the middle of the social class structure in these different countries. And the truth is that women, of course, struggle everywhere to navigate employment and motherhood. But the truth is that American moms struggled far more than the women in these other countries. And uniquely, they tended to often blame themselves for the difficulties they faced day in and day out. And to me, that was both tragic and also unsurprising, given that we tell families it's their job to do it all by themselves, right? And when women bear that disproportionate burden, of course, that means women try to do it all. And we know that's impossible when we live in a society that doesn't adequately support the combination of caregiving and employment, right? So in the pandemic, when schools and daycares closed down across the board, which was the country's largest infrastructure for care, someone had to take care of kids suddenly around the clock at home. Something had to give, and what very often gave was women's employment. And even small gaps in women's resumes have long-term career consequences for them. And of course, some women were impacted more deeply than others. We know that women of color, especially low-income women and single women raising children, suffered the most in the pandemic. So in some of these other countries, schools and daycares were the last places to close and the first places to reopen. And here in the US, we had gyms and bars and restaurants going before we had schools and daycares back up again. So to me, we have to contextualize this pandemic circumstance in the broader lack of public policy support that American women and their families face. And things are looking dire these days, if I'm being honest with you, though I don't think they have to be this way. The difficulty women face today is not inevitable. There's plenty we can do about it.
Absolutely, thank you. And you remind me of I spoke to a group on Monday of scholars from about 12 or 13 different countries. We were talking about gender equality and the United States and how things differed between our country and their country. And one of the things that I mentioned was the fact that in the United States, women on average receive 2 weeks of maternity leave before returning back to work. So women go back to work 2 weeks after having a child. And they were just incredibly stunned by that statistic because they could not envision that the United States was a country that didn't have that kind of support in place. But as you said, I mean, it's actually true, and that those supports weren't in place before, and the way in which they have had such a negative and devastating impact during the pandemic has just shown a really, really important light on it. So that's really, really important. And so, Dawn, Katie mentioned the impact of the pandemic on Black and Brown women, and we know that they have been disproportionately impacted. Um, the work that you're doing is really community-based efforts to uplift women and children. So what have you observed during the past 2 years, and what's made the biggest impression on you, or what have you found to be the biggest revelation as you've been working with this population?
Well, first, I'd like to say that one of the biggest revelations that I came across was that something that has been requested by women for years and years, which is home-based work, was possible. I'd hate to say it's easy, but it was possible. And it took a pandemic before our society considered allowing women to work from home. So just think of all of the barriers and challenges that are addressed just from women having that choice, childcare, transportation, family scheduling issues, all things that disproportionately fall on our shoulders when we're discussing issues like this. So it leads me to believe that many of our ideas, many of our requests are possible, are valid, but are just not as valued by society. And COVID has really highlighted how disproportionate and racist and systematic a lot of these choices are in the workplace. What I also found out is that only addressed part of women. Women maybe upper middle class and above, who already have those social supports included in their benefits. So the actual essential workers, those individuals who have to work every day, those individuals who could not work from home because the work that they did was with machinery or delivery or even healthcare. Those individuals didn't have the benefits that we had to, leave work, take our computer home, and still be able to get the work done. So how do we, as women with those benefits, help to amplify those voices of the women who may not have those voices in legislature or may not even have that voice in our communities? How do we find social supports for them that would address some of their issues? And an example I have, so in a lot of federal contract work that I do, transportation is written into it. And I don't know if you ladies know anything about Memphis, but Memphis's public transportation system is not very efficient and it's not very fast. So even if the government provides a bus card for those individuals, they are not able to get to work on time because it takes maybe 2 hours from their home to their work. So that social support isn't really effective. Why aren't we listening to the individuals who actually need those supports? Why aren't they speaking about what's best for them? Because they also offer what's called a gas card, and those are visas that pay for gas, but ride sharing isn't included in that. So if you don't own the transportation, you can't receive that support. So those are some of the things that I found that were really interesting as far as what is available to some of us and what isn't available to the rest of us.
That's a really great example. And it's also, it highlights sort of the way in which assumptions are made by even offering assistance without thinking about what that assistance means and how the intended recipient can even receive that assistance, and not for lack of something that they themselves are doing, but also because of the lack of understanding of those who are providing the support. And it's also about not asking the community that you are purporting to support what their specific needs are and how they can be supported. That's a very powerful point. And along those same lines, Kristen, when we talk about the challenges for individuals at work, and we know that many companies have and organizations have needed to adapt. As Dawn said, we did find out that there were many things that we were told weren't possible actually became possible. Many of them have done it, in very supportive and impressive ways. So, talk a bit about what have been some of the positive benefits from COVID-19 regarding work and family life for both employers and employees.
I mean, I think you're right there. We saw the agility of many corporations adjust seemingly overnight. And I think that's a really important point that Dawn called out. Things that weren't possible were all of a sudden possible. But I think she also made another great point. Not for everyone, not every sector received the same opportunities to work from home. As you're thinking about healthcare and manufacturing and retail and hospitality workers who have really kept the economy running for the past 2 years, thanks to their dedication to and in some cases because they had to for their own survival. And so I think that is worthy to call out again. But we have seen some benefits for employers. They'll talk about them first. First is productivity. I mean, you have employees who are no longer commuting. They are commuting from the kitchen to the kitchen table, and that commute gives more time to be in front of the computer and getting work done and collaborating with teammates to keep the business moving. We saw things like Zoom really help employers stay connected when we were all asked to be distanced from one another. And so the technology enabled employers to see that there is a way that you can maintain a sense of community and a sense of collaboration, even when folks, are states or even countries apart. And then I think the employers are also benefiting from a much larger talent pool now. Employers have access to people that they never had access to before because employees no longer have to think about, or candidates no longer have to think about how relocation or cost of living can potentially play into that calculus for whether or not they even want to seek a job with an employer that may be based in an environment that is a higher cost of living of where they're at. So I think there's a lot of upside for businesses who were able to be agile and adapt. I think there's also been a lot of upside for employees too that were able to adapt. Again, not everyone, but we've talked a couple times today, about the ability to care for loved ones, to care for children. I think what we really saw was a work-life integration, which a lot of people talk about. That's what they want. That's what we got in some cases. I think some cases we realized maybe we didn't want that because now it's almost impossible to see where work stops and your family ends. But for those who were able to successfully do it, you got time with kids that you probably wouldn't have gotten before. My personal situation, we had a preemie born at 29 weeks, and it meant the world to me to spend the last 2 years at home with him. Whereas the birth of my first child, I had 4 or 5 weeks until I had to go back to work. And so, I think the time that folks have been able to have with their loved ones, with their children in many cases, has been helpful. Now, not everybody is safe in their home. And I think that is something to think about on the flip side here, is to make sure that we don't think that home is a safe place where people want to be. But for those who are comfortable and safe and able to work from home, I think there were a lot of benefits. The last thing I'll talk about, and we talk a lot about, bringing our whole self to work. I think the pandemic and working from home has allowed people to truly find their authentic self and be their authentic self. And we've seen, kids that are coming into Zoom meetings and pets, and really start to see a part of people that you may not see at home that can help you build compassion and empathy for folks in a way that you just don't get until you get a glimpse into their life through a computer screen. And so I think that has helped build a lot of compassion and understanding for teams who are seemingly disconnected, to find ways to have conversations about things that we probably wouldn't have talked about had we been in the office. And I hope that is a benefit that lasts as we all think about returning back to the office.
Thanks, Kristen. Some really great points because you're mentioning of not just the benefits, but the challenges are a key part in how complex this whole past 2 years have been. Moving from the kitchen table, from the kitchen to the kitchen table to work, and that has also resulted, unfortunately, in some people not being able to see where the line between work and family is, and resulted in folks becoming burnt out. And that's a real situation that has often resulted in increased productivity, but increased burnout as well. And people had to navigate that in very important ways as we progressed through the pandemic. But you're right. Working working motherhood is definitely something that came to light, and how the challenges that were already in place just became, maybe some became easier, some just became a little different, but they still have the same level of need. So Katie, working motherhood is a balancing act, now more than ever, and it really can be a stressful endeavor for everyone everywhere. I am the mother of three. My youngest is now a junior in college, so I'm not worried about picking anyone up from daycare or summer camp. So I have crossed that threshold. But there are so many, millions of women who continue. But I remember how it was having to balance all of that with three children. So it really is a incredibly stressful endeavor for everyone. It's a global phenomenon. And in talking about your research, what has it shown, and do you have any advice for organizations about how to make things better for the working mothers on their staff?
Yeah, thank you for that, Gloria. These work family policies that I mentioned are certainly benefits that can be implemented at the organizational level. They don't have to necessarily be at the city, the county, the state, or the federal level. Though I am a firm proponent of passing many of these work family policies at a national level, because it creates disparities in our labor force when some organizations can and are capable of offering paid family and medical leave, vacation and sick days, the flexibility to work remotely or to flex your schedule, right? Robust healthcare provisions, right? Those are wonderful and important benefits to offer your employees. But there's a problem when only some sorts of workers have access to those sorts of policies and others do not. So it actually, unfortunately, kind of creates some disparities between workers who do have access to those supportive, helpful work family policies and those that do not. So for organizations that don't have them, finding ways to implement them, of course, would be a wonderful leap in the right direction and helping support working mothers, working parents. The truth is that I talk often about working mothers, but we all have loved ones who need care, regardless of whether or not it's our kids, perhaps a partner, ailing parents, right? And so adopting policies that can be used to care for all sorts of loved ones, I think, is really important. And as Kristen mentioned, I think really insightfully a moment ago, this idea of bringing compassion and empathy and understanding, especially in a global pandemic, to your workers is really important. And the truth is, as Kristen mentioned, we're seeing little kiddos running across the back of a screen or sitting at a table like I have here. The reality is that the unconscious biases that we mentioned at the beginning of the call result in managers, employers sometimes interpreting that differently for different kinds of workers, right? So when moms have little ones on the screen, sometimes we read that differently and in many ways worse than when dads have little kids on the screen in the background, right? We could stereotype as our society as a whole, as we started our call talking about, we stereotype moms as being less capable and committed on the job once they have children. And the inverse happens for men. We call this the motherhood wage penalty and the fatherhood wage premium, right? When moms have kids, when women have kids, they receive on average a 5% reduction in their pay per child. And fathers receive the inverse because we think of breadwinning, financial provision as being central to what good fatherhood looks like. So when a man has little kids on the screen in the background, they often receive, oohs and ahs and kind of congratulatory remarks about participating. Whereas for women, it's just another day, right? And maybe they're distracting them from doing their job. So one other thing I think organizations can do during this challenging time when so many of us are working remotely is to stop ourselves and think carefully about how we're interpreting those sorts of windows into people's lives, right? Not everybody has a home environment with a room that they can close a door and not be interrupted for 8 hours at a time, right? Not everybody has the space in their home, the childcare that they need, a partner to help around the house, for example. And so employers can also spend some time thinking about what it would mean to conscientiously encourage workers to bring their whole selves to the workplace, as Kristen mentioned. And the point that Dawn made is a really good one about the fact that you can have policies on the books or offer support to workers, But if they don't feel comfortable actually using them, or they're not really relevant to their daily lives, that's a problem. And so a direct line of communication, as Gloria pointed out, turning to folks to ask, what would help you right now, right? It doesn't sound like a gas card or a metro pass or a bus pass is very useful. What would help you more, right? Turning to folks in communities that we want to support is the best way forward. And so organizations can certainly turn to their workers and ask what would benefit them most right now. So these direct lines of communication that enable people to bring their whole self to work without feeling hesitant or fearing retaliation in the workplace is really important too. I'll leave it there so that my panelists, my co-panelists can add to the conversation.
Thanks so much, Katie. I think your point around the difference in interpretation, and a lot of it based on stereotypes and biases around women as mothers and men as dads. It's also about how men are often said to be babysitting, when they're watching their own kids, and they're not. They're just parenting. They're not actually babysitting, and so that different interpretation, finds itself, throughout the way in which people judge women once they become mothers, and men once they become fathers. And so we've talked a bit. Let's switch a bit. We've talked a bit about the conversation around working from home and the fact that so much of the labor and work from home conversation excludes low wage workers and those with less education, right? The benefit of those who have the privilege of being able to work from home. And we also, particularly in the past few years, we hear a lot about upskilling and reskilling. And we know, and this happened during the pandemic, that more women joined the gig economy. They became Door Dashers and Uber drivers just to make their ends meet. So, Dawn, I want to ask the question, I want to address the question posed in your bio. It says, how can we make complex developmental information accessible and engaging to populations with needs for unique options to narrow the educational gap? And I'd also like for you to talk a bit about what role does adult education and training play in supporting women of color to thrive? It's a
Thank you
mouthful,
so
I know.
much. Well, adult education and training focused on upskilling and reskilling is really our efforts to add skilled workers to the workforce, to ensure that those workers continue to grow like our society grows, that they have the tools that they need to effectively do the things that are expected of them. My question becomes, where are the efforts in our organizations to support those individuals? And I'd like to address the gig efforts that a lot of individuals have started doing, the mass resignation that has happened in our society because of the lack of those supports. So if there are individuals like me who are supporting the workforce, who trains individuals, coaches them, helps them with communication skills and assists them with, upskilling and being prepared for our workforce. Where are the deliberate developmental organizations that focus on the supports for those individuals? Who bridges those gaps? So how do we keep those individuals in the workforce? Because as all you ladies know, ladies and women are innovators. We are creators. We are individuals who figure a way out of no way. And that's, it's very true in the African American community also. So instead of us being able to access the innovations of these individuals, the creativity of these individuals, they're leaving the workforce because they've seen that the workforce isn't supporting them. So why should I be in a place where you don't care about my children? You don't care about my time, don't really care about me eating because the pay that I'm receiving isn't a livable wage. Whereas I can use my mind, I can use my creativity to create what I want. How are we going to combat that and still keep that workforce? Because I know that a lot of organizations right now, you go to restaurants, your packages are late. There is no workforce because there are no social supports there to keep those innovators in those organizations. There are no supports there to keep those individuals who have something to offer, who have something to give in those organizations. But as far as upskilling, adult education, that's a very important part of our workforce. So how do we assist individuals and bridge the gap between public education and going out into the workforce? How do we bridge those communication gaps? How do we bridge those gaps with an understanding of how basic machinery works? So in my position, what I've done, I've had to learn so many different things in order to teach those things to individuals who have to work in those environments. I've never worked in a warehouse, but I've had to teach basic machinery. I've had to teach how warehouses work in order for those individuals to enter those environments and be effective for those organizations.
That's really important when you think about the fact that um, people see the gig economy and they see this increase in women starting business as also being something to applaud when we talk about, the hustle culture, and they don't always attribute it to the fact that women aren't earning a living wage, and that's why they're earning three jobs. They have to work three jobs. And if the supports around, not just using the words around upskilling and reskilling, but those supports were in place within organizations to allow women to, get to that next level, then part of their needs being met, would happen in their workplaces, and they wouldn't be out, working multiple jobs, just to be able to take care of themselves and their families. And I think also it's really interesting that adult education, and which doesn't necessarily mean getting a degree, is something that is becoming more and more common. I mean, I just heard this morning in my own state, I live in Maryland, that the state government has eliminated a number of the of jobs that to have a requirement that you have a college degree. And so, opening up the workforce also to people who can demonstrate that they have the skills, and that they have the training, but they don't necessarily have a college degree. And if they did, what would that have brought to the table other than the fact that they already actually have been doing this work? So I think that that's a real important acknowledgement of being able to open up the workforce and to give people more opportunities for advancement, which often not having a college degree really holds people back. Um, and when we're talking, I think Dawn talking about employees and what they have to offer, and listening to them and helping them along their journeys to the next step. Kristen, we know that taking time to learn from employees really offers important insights about hiring and talent retention. I mean, we talked about the gas card, we talked about the great resignation and the great negotiation. Every week there's a new name for it, which is, really referring to the over 33 million, mostly low wage Americans who quit their jobs since the spring of of 2021. And I'm wondering what you think about how employers can gain, additional insight about how they can retain their talent and, you know, what are some of the benefits of ensuring that you have a diverse and inclusive organization?
It's a great question, and I thought Dawn's comments were fantastic. I think employers can't make assumptions. They need to make connections right now, and connecting with their employees and really listening to hear what the need is, without any preconceived notion of what that need is. And so sometimes I talk about that as like hearing the concern behind the concern, and being willing to go deep enough into those connections to understand what folks actually need, and be willing to take those steps, and not just assume. Because with the gas card, it's a great example. It's a great example of where you think, employers sometimes think they know better, than their own employees. Just listen to your employees and give them what they want. I think that's the best way to go. And that can look like surveying, that can look like focus groups, it can look like poll surveys, engagement surveys. It can look like walking the floors, and just talking to people, and just being willing to actively listen to what employees have to say, and then do something. I think that's where a lot of employers drop the ball. You can go have all the town halls you want and ask all the questions you want, but it's the action that employees want to see based on those conversations that make them feel heard, and appreciated, for the work that they're doing. I think that the D&I imperative in this, the options are open. Like I said, like accessibility right now is just opening up so many opportunities on the candidate and employer side to explore options that were more difficult before. Now it's just a matter of making those connections. I don't think anybody's arguing about why D&I is important anymore. I think folks have gotten that piece. But now, so what are you going to do about it? And it's not just about what large corporations or big brands are doing about it. Small businesses can do something about it too. It is that intentional work and being deliberate in your hiring practices and in your processes that bring people into the organization and keep them there once they're inside, because you have inclusive benefits, or because you have leave policies that are inclusive. It's not about just bringing folks in and creating the most diverse team. It's understanding what those diverse set of needs are to make sure the team stays together, and folks don't have to go looking somewhere else for something that you could give them yourself.
Really, really, really excellent point. And when we talk about employers, in particular, Dawn, how can mentorship, sponsorship, and similar types of support play a role in increasing, not just educational success, which I know that you're very passionate about, but also workplace leadership? How can individuals or businesses and schools develop partnerships or collaborative projects with local communities and employers to mentor young women for careers? Because that's the way that employers can get the talent that they're looking for when they work on those collaborative projects, and processes, and also participate in mentoring, and working in other supportive roles with their intended workforce.
Let me think of a way to say this. So there's something that I teach in my workshops, and we talk about how OJT, on the job training, started at the beginning of time. with mothers and their children, and how just watching a mother do things around the house taught children how to do that. And I think that our systems, communities, organizations have gotten so disconnected from the root of how we do things, so we, I think, have to not only look at the macro of what we do, but the micro of it also, because our families and their success is a reflection of how successful our communities will be. So presently, everywhere we're having these conversations, organizations are having conversations with community organizations and businesses on how to be more effective. But where are those individuals from those communities in those conversations? What would community ambassadors look like coming out of the actual communities that we serve? Those individuals who know the ins and out. And my best friend and I sometimes sit around and we talk about how we remember our moms sitting on the porch, how they knew their neighbors, how they knew the community around them and what was needed, and how that community helped each other, how they provided things for each other. So say we pull out these community ambassadors and we train them to serve the communities that they come from, instead of bringing individuals from New York or any other place into this community who, quote unquote, knows best how to serve these individuals. What would that look like? They could have mentors, those people from the community would then mentor those children in the community, as a community mentorship. Not just the organizations having those mentors, but the professionals in that organization could be partnered with those community ambassadors and help to mentor them so that they grow. So not only would the organization from within grow, but we would be pulling in those individuals from the community and helping that community grow also.
Excellent point. It all goes back to, what we commonly hear, that, you can't be what you can't see.
Yes.
If these young women are not having these role models or having the opportunity to really envision potential careers that they could aspire to, that in and of itself is a roadblock for their own advancement. And anyone who is with us today from New York, we're not saying that coming down to Memphis from New York is a bad thing, just so you know.
We are not.
We love New York. We love New York.
We do. Some of my favorite people come from New York.
Thank you. Thank you, Dawn. So, Kristen, we haven't talked a lot about leadership, and we know that women are still lacking roles in management and leadership, and that for companies of all kinds, that the talent disruptions caused by the pandemic have been pretty significant. And I want you to talk a bit about how leaders in organizations can step up to the challenge and reimagine work to ensure that women don't continue to face a glass, or for women of color, a concrete ceiling to the top.
I think first and foremost, the work has to be intentional. We have to call it what it is, and make sure we are enrolling our leaders and executives into the notion that we have to make sure we don't create a glass or concrete ceiling for women. I think the other big thing is, radical sponsorship, for lack of a better word. It is one thing to mentor folks, but I think sponsoring people and making sure that they are in the room when they are not in the room is the best thing that we can do for women. And I learned this when I was junior in my career. There was somebody that I wanted to sponsor me, and I'd never met her before, but I knew who she was, and I ran up to her and said, "Hey, I want you to be my mentor." And you all can imagine how that went. Um, and I don't want us to have women thinking that that's what we have to do. That we have to go begging one another to help us get into leadership roles, but that we are willing to help one another, because we see potential and we see leadership and we see the advantage that having a specific person in a specific position will lend to the business. And it was the first time that I was asked to sit on a board. I didn't know who nominated me for that, but I started to recognize that's what that is. Somebody was thinking of me when there was an ask for a specific skill set. And so I've made that part of my leadership and how we talk about things in our organization, to make sure we're thinking and we're hearing where somebody that we know could be a good fit, and we're willing to step out and say that in the rooms where people are making decisions. And so I think that's, we have to be intentional about those moments, and know who your talent is and have relationships with those people, so you feel confident giving a name or making a recommendation for a certain project.
Yeah, very, very important points when you talk about. I love the term radical sponsorship, right? Because it really is about people not looking at it in its sort of formal way that people may have interpreted it. Like, it has to be reinterpreted to meet today's needs, and also that women really need to be standing up for other women, which can be a challenge, and there's certainly enough research about how, women are not standing up for other women, or, women think that because they were subjected to so much stereotype and bias and discrimination, and they made it through that, well, you should have to go through it as well. But the conversation around mentorship and sponsorship, I think, is important. And about building women leaders. Yesterday, the White House had its Women's History program and Women's History Month program, and I re the First Lady made a very poignant comment about, why women, in talking about her mother, about why women should, be supportive of other women, and in particular women who are leaders, and, the special responsibility that you have. And she said to the group who was there, she said, "We're here today because someone believed in us. Someone taught us to be brave, and we are here to be those women for someone else." And I've been thinking about that, ever since she said it, because it really talks about the fact that someone was there for us to get us where we are, and what are we doing to be there for someone else, right? It's lifting as we climb. So, the leadership piece is really, really important in increasing leadership, because if it was going to work by having men in charge, well, it would have worked by now. We know that that's not the case. So Katie, before we get to the audience questions, I want to ask you, talking about the gender divide, as we've talked about, and how it's really shaping both the pandemic's economic consequences and its recovery. And it really is a deep-seated component of the U.S. labor market. We're still, as we talked earlier about, we're still based on the male breadwinner model, which clearly men have not been the breadwinners for decades, and it's really not a model that works in 2022 and won't work in the future. So, how should our leaders and elected officials be thinking about rectifying these inequities and really building a more sustainable and supported workforce in our country?
Oh, I have so much to say on this, and I'm eager to hear from my co-panelists about this too. I want to reiterate the point you just made about how this model, this male breadwinner model, it doesn't reflect reality in 2022. Not only is it not working, it's not empirically true anymore. You know, women work nearly on par with men in the paid labor force today. 70% of mothers work for pay outside the home in the United States. Most of them work full time. Mothers are the primary or sole breadwinner in a huge percentage of US families today. So it's no longer actually the reality to talk about families being headed by a male breadwinner, right? So we have to get with the times. And if we're thinking about how policymakers can help do that, as I mentioned, my expertise is in this area of combining kind of, you know, caregiving and employment. And the truth is the sorts of policies we've been talking about today that would help bolster women and their families, they are a win-win-win-win-win, right? These policies like paid family and medical leave, setting a federal minimum standard for vacation and sick days, implementing, for example, what I hope is a universal pre-K system here soon, and at least in my opinion, extending that to a universal childcare system more broadly for kids of all ages, you know, raising the minimum wage. We can make arguments for all of these policies that are moral and ethical, because I think the folks on this call at least can agree that that's pretty straightforward. We can make a feminist argument for why all these policies are good. Research shows abundantly that these policies have either neutral or positive effects for employers on things like worker productivity, as we talked about earlier, on profitability, and also on things like turnover and morale, right? So if policymakers don't find they're getting a lot of political traction by making an ethical argument or a feminist argument, then let's make a business case, right? If that's what we have to do by any means necessary, that's where I'm at in 2022 at this stage of the pandemic. I'm like, let's throw every argument at this humanly possible, right? Because there is broad-based across the aisle support for the sorts of policies that would help reduce these inequalities, right? And if we implement these policies at a federal level, this means that it would help reduce inequalities of race and gender and class. It would reduce disparities between workers who work for companies who offer them voluntarily and those who work for companies who can't or won't. It will reduce disparities between folks who live in states like California that offer some of these policies on the books and those who live and work a few mere miles away across a state border that doesn't offer them, right? It's like a rising tide lifts all boats here. And the truth is, we have been, this is a phrase a couple of wonderful economists coined, we have been free riding on women's labor for all of United States history, right? Expecting them to keep their households afloat without any actual real material support. And the reality is, if we want to support kids and women and families and businesses and speed economic growth nationally to increase the competitiveness of our nation as a whole against other countries, these policies help advance all of those causes. So to me, thinking of these as basic features of our infrastructure, right? In the same way that we all need a road that's safe and reliable to get on to drive to work, we need care providers to have a healthy and safe place for our kiddos to spend time so that we can go do our jobs, right? If we need to make an argument through this lens of infrastructure rather than a feminist argument, so be it, but let's just throw everything at it and try to think really expansively and creatively about getting these policies passed at a federal level, because as I said, I think it's a win on all bases.
Definitely. Thanks, Katie. And these are all policies that AAUW has been advocating for decades. And, you know, I think that as they slowly, you know, get passed, we can see the benefits of them. But we also know that there is ongoing resistance. What we ultimately want, obviously, are for these policies to be, you know, to be the norm and not the exception. And to really keep pushing that argument of how, we can talk about it being of benefit, for individuals and families, but it also is a benefit to our communities and to our economies and that business case. Unfortunately, sometimes that's what it has to be in order to sway people to do the right thing. And it should be enough that it's going to improve the lives of individuals, citizens, and or their families. But clearly, it's a very politicized issue as well. So thank you. And looking at this conversation, I want to definitely thank you all. There's been so many just amazing comments, and it's been a really great discussion. And we've talked a lot about how the world of work continues to change rapidly for women. And we've identified some solutions. We've talked about some of the challenges, but for someone who is watching and listening in, what can they do? What do we want to encourage folks to not just think about, but maybe to take some action on? And it could be to increase their own leadership or economic security, or to do some work in their community. What would you encourage our participants to do? And also, what are you most hopeful about as we very slowly, I hope, emerge from the pandemic? Let's start. You want to go first, Kristen?
Sure, happy to. If I had to say in one sentence, sponsor someone. That's it. Find someone who is fantastic and go to bat for them in every way that you can. Connect them with every person that you can, and really be an advocate for someone because you believe in what they can do and the good that they can have in the world. Find somebody and sponsor them.
And what are you most hopeful about for the future?
Gloria, I thought that I was an introvert. Man, I've really missed people. I've missed people for the past 2 years, and I can't wait to be back in the office and just have, connections with folks and conversations over lunch, and those sidebar walking down the hall conversations that normally fix the problem behind the problem. I want that back, and I'm really excited to start to move in that direction.
It is, particularly if you have not been back, AAUW, we're going back into the office, and it it's an amazing feeling seeing a colleague in person that you haven't seen in person in 2 years, and also seeing new staff that came on during the pandemic, that you've never met. So, those connections are important, and I think also we have seen during the pandemic as well that that misguided email really could have been a face-to-face conversation if you just walked down the hall and cleared it up, because emails can often be misinterpreted. So that personal connection, you're right, I agree 100%, is really, really important. Dawn, what are your thoughts?
I guess if I was to sum it up in a sentence or two, it would be fearless. Push activate on your innovation. Have those difficult conversations. And to quote Tracy Chapman, what I'm most looking forward to is this is a revolution. And right now it sounds like a whisper, but I want to hear what our future women have to say. I want to hear it when it's loud enough to actually change how we're living.
Excellent. Excellent. Katie?
Okay, if I had to sum this up in a sentence or two, it would be that I hope that folks learn to expect more and expect better from those around them, from their partners, from their community members, from their colleagues, their bosses and managers, and from their elected officials. I think, again, I mentioned that we tend to individualize our stresses, but when we recognize that individual problems actually have systemic roots, right? These are actually social problems. If so many women and their families are struggling to make it work, we can adopt all the individual solutions we want, but in fact, we need to implement societal level solutions. And that first requires that we think we deserve more from the people around us. So trying to instill in women this idea that they deserve more and should expect it from those around them by way of support is one message I want to pass along. And I am hopeful that that is beginning to happen more than I've ever seen it. I've been working on this research for a decade now, and women historically, when I've spoken to them pre-pandemic, seemed really resigned to how kind of stressed, overwhelmed, burned out, guilty, conflicted they felt about their kind of daily lives navigating caregiving and employment. But I think the pandemic has really exposed the truth that care is a central feature of our society and it deserves our support. And I'm seeing folks say, wait a minute, other countries are handling this really differently. Some employers are handling this much better than others. So I think that we need to build on that momentum, this questioning, like, does it have to be this way? And can it be better? Is something I want to encourage folks to believe in, but also something I'm feeling really hopeful about. I think folks are feeling fed up and angry. And I think those are actually really productive feelings that I think we can channel into social change, both in our family life, but also at our workplaces and also more broadly in society.
Three very, very pertinent and inspiring comments for sure. And I would definitely say, Katie, that it's not just about, clearly we really should be expecting more, but we should also demand more. And, the sort of sitting back and accepting the things that clearly have not been working for us. We are beyond that particular stage in our world. So I want to take a look at a number of we have some time to do a few of the questions that have come in from our participants. Thank you all very much. And I'll start with, we talked a bit about the issue of women supporting women. So I think, we could probably move on from that because we talked about, certainly Kristen's notion of radical sponsorship and that, women really do need to step up for each other. And, as I mentioned before, the research does show that, women leaders are not always as supportive of other women as we would want them to do. So I think it's continuing to push that supportive culture and that we should all be lifting as we climb. And I hope that the words of First Lady Jill Biden will certainly inspire someone to think about the person that supported you to be where you are and how we should be that person for someone else, for sure. Let's see, for this question, how can educators and leaders facilitate space and guidance for women to do that individual work in dismantling unconscious bias that Kristen described?
I'm good jumping in there. I think part of it's got to be some intrinsic motivation too, to understand I need to do something to help, right? So you need folks that are intrinsically motivated to understand the problem that folks are trying to solve, and folks that are willing to go on their own journey to understand their role and their place in perpetuating a system that doesn't work for everybody. And then that's when I think like educators and leaders can come alongside those folks and help guide the journey. But I fundamentally believe it starts with an individual realizing that something is wrong and that they are contributing to a system that is creating inequities for other people. Once that light bulb goes on for somebody, then it's hard to get them to stop because they want to continue to dig deeper and help make that change. And so I think the more you can help folks have that light bulb moment of their contribution or, stagnation in a system, then I think that it is what really starts to spur people's curiosity and lead them to begin their journey. And having a groundswell of people like that in an organization is how organizations start to change.
I'd like to jump in. I agree, Kristen. As an adult educator, one of the first things we learn is that adult education is not a one-way street. It's an exchange. So learning communities, having those conversations, and not being afraid to get off track, allowing the conversation to go where it goes so that we can discover those little gems that are hidden along the way. I think that's one of the most important things. So many times we have our own agenda and we want to stay on track. We need to allow these conversations to grow and develop as they will.
Really great points, Dawn and Kristen. And, I think that the individual work that people need to do is tough work, but you have to be willing to do it and not to be thinking that there's something external that's going to help you do the work that you need to do, right? It needs to be your own internal motivation. Thanks. We have talked quite a bit about US-based challenges, which obviously have a global relationship as well to women around the world. I know, Katie, that your work, as you mentioned, focused on examining women in other countries. So could you just talk a little bit about, how some of the observations that you saw in that research, how they relate to what you also see here in our own country?
Sure. Yeah, and I should say also, I'm on an AAUW panel, so it's worth mentioning the first draft for that book was written on a fellowship from AAUW. So when we're thinking about what it means to lift up other women, that's it. Here's an example of an organization that did that had very real material consequences for me personally, but also professionally. So thanks, AAUW. The international component of my research was really insightful because we don't spend a lot of time about, as Americans, thinking about what daily life is like for folks elsewhere. I think the war in Ukraine is one example where we're seeing folks do that in a way that they haven't historically in other conflicts for a host of intricate reasons we won't get into now. But talking to women about what life is like elsewhere, I think is really insightful because it shows us here in the US that life can be different and better, right? In Sweden, for example, talking to women about how they handle daily responsibilities around the house with their partners, for those who are partnered with men, and hearing them talk about an expectation of equality in the home was a revelation for me from an American perspective, right? The assumption of equality rather than, the hope or the abstract dream or whatever, but the actual belief that of course men and women can do the same thing around the house and they also should, was so mind-blowing to me. And in fact, that cultural belief of gender equality is also both reflected and reinforced in the country's policies, right? So their gender equality policy is intimately interwoven with their family policy and their labor policy, right? And gender equality is a cornerstone of Swedish law more broadly. And you see it playing out in day-to-day life in a way that just opened my eyes to the reality that it's of course possible in the United States too, right? But we don't, as you said, we can't be what we can't see. And we don't have models, for example, of families who are doing things in a way that looks quite equal. it's really hard to envision that it's possible for us. But I do think looking at other countries for examples of how things are working can shed light on the reality that we are quite far behind our peer nations as a country here in the United States. And we can do that at the organizational level too, right? Kristen, for example, right, comes from a background that's engaged in the sort of cross-national work that happens in the world of tech, for example. You know, Swedish companies work really differently than American companies do in some ways, and we can learn lessons for them and vice versa, right? So I think that paying attention to what's happening elsewhere is one way to open up the possibilities we can see as very real in our own lives in a way that we don't when we feel really resigned. And I think, as Kristen said, she's missing connection. Me too. And I think sitting at home day after day, week after week, month after month, we're very insulated and isolated. And I think that's a problem. So thinking about paying attention to news sources, for example, that aren't just US based is one really easy way we can get a glimpse into what life is like elsewhere and how, again, we can reimagine what we think of as possible for ourselves. So I'll stop there instead of rambling.
No, that's very, very insightful information because the revelation of how other countries and societies have made it work for women and families is something that clearly it's possible, and it has been taking place for a very long time. The World Economic Forum rankings just came out recently, and the fact that, for the 12th year in a row, that, Iceland is the most, gender, equitable country. And when you look at the list of those who are in the top 10, it's always, usually the same countries. And their proven strategies could certainly be adapted by other countries. But there are so many things, whether it's economy, cultures, politics, right, that impact the ability to make that happen. And I think it's important to note that we are here these 2 weeks, hearing all of the conversations at the United Nations and with the civil society organizations on how they have set forth, all of their goals, and all of their targets and benchmarks, for gender equality. But exactly what does that look like on the ground? And in part, who are the ones who are carrying out so much of that work? And a lot of that work takes place with civil society organizations like AAUW and so many of the global organizations and coalitions that ensure that women are actually, able to move forward. And we would love to continue to hold the countries accountable, right, for what they say they're going to do in order to improve the conditions and lives of women and girls in their countries, and so that it doesn't just become a piece of paper or statement on a website, that it translates into real action, because the proof is there that it is possible to create an equitable society that works for everyone, for sure. So thanks, Katie. And I think the when we have these conversations, people often say, "Well, you're just preaching to the choir, and women are always just talking to each other about what should be done and what we've been trying to do. What about men, and why aren't they in this conversation as well?" And so let's talk about men. What is the advice we talk about the systems that are in place, we talk about the systemic racism and sexism and stereotypes and bias that takes place. So men in the workforce who are holding these managerial and leadership positions, or even those who are peers, how can they be the ones to help move the needle on so many of the things that all of you have talked about today? Go ahead. Anyone want to jump in?
Yes, I'll jump in. Go ahead.
You got it, Don. You got it.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess by being supportive, stepping outside of what can be benefited personally from being supportive in our fight, because essentially I think a lot of men view it as our fight, not necessarily as a systemic or a societal issue that would truly benefit all if addressed. I think they see a lot of it as loss. You know, we're going to lose those great women in our homes, or, you know, things will be out of balance. But if men stepped into these situations, supporting us, being vocal, and understanding that there are long-term benefits to this, and seeing, like Caitlin mentioned, that other societies view this as a beneficial thing, and it is beneficial in their society, I think that we could move forward at a much quicker pace than the one we are presently.
I think partially, like, they have to go first. They can't wait on us to invite them into a conversation or to ask them to engage on our behalf. We need men who are motivated, understand what's going on, and who are willing to stand up and speak up and go first in excuse me, in what may be difficult, conversations for them. But we need them to have the professional courage in the workplace to do that, and not wait to be asked into the conversation or into the fight with us. They should just know that they're part of this, and it is as much their responsibility as ours to keep us moving forward.
I love that. And we'll just echo this point about sponsorship and allyship on the part of men, right? This is not a zero-sum game. It's actually good for all of us, including men, when we advance the cause, for example, of gender equality or racial equality or class-based justice, right? Men are, the truth is, they occupy a position of structural advantage over women as a group. And just because an individual man doesn't feel that day in and day out doesn't make it not true. And so I really echo both the points that you're making about this willingness to support women, but also a need to be proactive about it, right? If you're in a work meeting and you see, just observe the dynamics, and you see a woman getting spoken over often or interrupted, be an interrupter yourself and say, I'm sorry, I think someone just cut Dawn off. Dawn, did you want to finish your point? Your ability to do that is greater than Dawn's at the table, right? That's just an empirical fact of reality. Whether we like it or not doesn't really matter because it's true. And so I think we can ask men to do that sort of work without needing to be asked constantly, right? Thinking in themselves to how they can leverage their power to be allies and sponsors to the women in their families and in their workplaces and in their communities, I think would move us forward by leaps and bounds in really productive ways.
Really great points and great advice. One final question. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Talk a bit about we spoke about this just a little bit, but the notion that there could be a downside to working from home for women, and that they may have less visibility, and that their work may have less visibility within their own organizational or business power structure. What are your thoughts about that?
I think there's some potential truth to it.
Mm-hmm.
I think it would be naive to think that if women are experiencing challenges in the workforce when we're sitting next to one another, that those challenges are going to go away when we're distanced. And so, I think just recognizing it as a possibility is a start. And I think, taking proactive steps to make sure you are over communicating, like that's something a woman can do herself, to over communicate in these situations, just to be very clear about the contributions that you're making and the impact that you're making. A lot of that's not visible right now. And so making it visible, I think is really important. And I think part of it too is thinking about your career and the strategy that goes along with your career. And if there are decisions that we're making about, moving up in leadership, or, working from home or being in the office, like I still think you have to like do the math on that. It is the unfortunate reality of sometimes you have to be present, and really weighing that in your calculus about where you want your career to go and the impact that you want to make, and the return on deciding to go in or to not go in, and how that has the impact. But I think you've got to do the math on the situation and be realistic about the impacts and the decisions that you're making too.
I agree. Not only that, but even though we have moved from, or we think we've moved from the whole decisions are being made by the water cooler concept, there are still a lot of rooms that decisions are being made in that women aren't invited into. So us being home, I don't think will necessarily put us at that much of a disadvantage, because there are a lot of conversations going on in the workplace when we're there that we're not a part of. So it'll also, like Kristen said, help us to focus on strategy, on our professional organizations, on, how do we leverage these different rooms, professional rooms, or, community organizations, to be places where women form those connections, or, catapult our professions, team building efforts, how organizations find different ways to be innovative. Those are going to be the things that we have to focus on, as opposed to, depending on being in a certain building as our opportunity for promotion or for gain.
Very well said. Thank you all so much. That was a really important insight. I'm glad we had an opportunity to talk about that, because it is an issue that is in the forefront of so many women as we look at this hybrid or work from home workplace. So thank you, Dawn. Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, Katie, for joining me and all of our participants this afternoon. I really appreciate you sharing your insight and your knowledge and your time. And Kristen, I can tell that you hung in there with your voice, and we appreciate you really pushing through to the end. We will be posting this panel on the AAUW website at aauw.org, so you'll be able to access it probably in another week or so. I want to thank the AAUW staff for all the support in pulling together this event, and just thank everyone who is playing a role in the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women 66 during these next 2 weeks, including the UN and the NGO committee, as well as UN Women. And I think the panelists, all of you, talked in very simple terms about what we all want. We want fairness, we want equity, and we want an equal shot at success to rid our society of the barriers that continue to exist to hold women back. And that we acknowledge that this is a systemic issue, that it's not just a woman's issue, and that it's an economic and a societal issue and a family issue, that everyone can play a role in galvanizing support and raising awareness to, so that we can bring more equity to our workplaces and our homes and our society as a whole and our communities. Because it's really up to us to create a just present and future. It really is in our hands. And, the pandemic benefit is that our society is really seeing an awakening of the economic power of women's contributions. And I know we all hope that women use that to leverage it to demand that the system be fixed. And and that the pervasive inequities in our workplaces go away. The momentum we hope will continue to pick up, and I'm hopeful that with organizations like AAUW and our partners that we continue through advocacy and enforcement and implementation of the laws that are on the books already, that we will get there. I am hopeful that we'll get there. So thank you for your participation. Please do visit our website at aauw.org and learn more about how you can have an impact on these important issues that impact women in the workplace, in our higher education institutions, and in our communities. Thank you all.